All right, we are continuing our study through the letter of 1 Corinthians here on the Listener's Commentary, and in this recording, we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 through 16. And keeping the context in mind, Paul's been addressing issues in the Corinthian church, particularly related to sexuality and marriage. There was that man who was sleeping with his stepmom in chapter 5. There was the issue of going to prostitutes at the end of chapter 6. And now here in chapter 7, he begins to address some issues and questions related to sexuality and marriage that the Corinthians had actually written him about. And so in our last recording, we looked at chapter 7, 1 through 9, where Paul dealt with the issue specifically of sex in marriage itself. And it grew out of a Corinthian idea that's causing a lot of these problems. At least some of the church has that, and that is it's good never to have sex, right? Like it's good to avoid sex altogether. Paul's answer is no, that's not good. If you're widowed or single, and God has gifted you with the ability to remain single and celibate for God's sake, well, then do it. But otherwise, get married. And if you're married, be sure you don't keep sex from your spouse. That was chapter 7, 1 through 9. But that's not the only question that the Corinthians had about marriage. It's not the only issue they were facing. It does seem that some of the issues that he's going to address in this section are in some way connected to that basic idea that started the chapter, right? We saw that in verse 1. It's good for a man not to touch a woman. That they were wrestling with this idea. Is it morally better way to live to abstain from sex and marriage altogether? And so some of the other questions seem to still be wrestling with this. Like, is it best just to never get married? Is it best to get unmarried? Like if you're married and it's more holy and spiritual to avoid sex and maybe avoid marriage, then should you get unmarried, right? And so some of the other questions that show up in this chapter, I think are loosely connected to this false idea that's plaguing the Corinthian church. At least some in the church are holding it and maybe stirring up trouble in the church with it. And so now Paul is going to tackle some of those other questions and issues. And the first one he's going to tackle is the issue of divorce. And so he says in verse 10, "Now to the married I give instructions, not I but the Lord." Why does he start verse 10 with to the married? Well, recall verse 8 where he said to the unmarried and the widows, and then he gives instructions. So now he's continuing the conversation to people who are married. And so to people who are unmarried, if they don't want to get married and they can do that, and God has enabled them by grace to do that, great. But, verse 10, to the married I give instructions, not I but the Lord. And why does he say, not I but the Lord? Well, Paul is actually passing along the Lord Jesus' instructions about divorce and remarriage, and that's why he says it. So I give instructions, and then he's like, well, technically, this isn't from me. This is actually from Jesus, as found in Matthew chapter 5 or Matthew 19 or Mark chapter 10. Maybe a few other places in the Gospels where there is specific, clear, direct teaching from Jesus on the question of two believers who are thinking about getting divorced. And so the reason Paul says it the way he does here, I give instructions, well, not I, but the Lord, is because in verse 12, he's going to make the point that on the question of what if you're married to a pagan? Well, he doesn't have a direct teaching from Jesus on that because Jesus never had to address that question. So Paul's going to give instructions here, but what he's really doing is summarizing and applying the direct, clear teaching of Jesus on this question of divorce and remarriage. And so here's Paul's summary of it. He says in the rest of verse 10 that the wife is not to leave her husband, but if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband is not to divorce his wife. So because Paul is going to tackle marriage to unbelievers immediately after this, it seems pretty clear that what he's dealing with here is two believers who are considering divorce. And just as Jesus had said in his ministry, Paul's basic instruction, applying Jesus' teaching, is quite clear. Don't divorce each other. That's his instruction. The wife is not to leave her husband. The husband is not to divorce his wife. And in fact, in their culture, the most common way to divorce somebody was just to leave. Just say, I'm done with you, pack your things, and leave. You could formalize it more with paperwork if you wanted to. And so both the wife leaving or the husband divorcing, it refers to the same thing, and the instruction is clear. Don't do it. Don't divorce each other. Now, some things that help us understand a little bit more what's going on here. Unlike in Israel, where Jesus taught, in Corinth, both women and men could initiate divorce. Among the Jews, in Jesus' original context, only men could initiate it. That's why when you read Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5, Matthew 19, Mark 10, and other places, when you read Jesus' teaching, it's male-specific, because he's addressing his culture. So what we see here is Paul applying Jesus' teaching from the Gospels to a new context here in Corinth. And the situation in Corinth may have been just as simple as the Corinthians simply kind of bringing their baggage, their cultural baggage with them into the church. And in the context of Corinthian culture, divorce was easy and fairly common. And this seems more likely to me in some regard, maybe it's a combination of the two, or perhaps it was related to the abstaining from sex, right? That issue seems to really be plaguing the church and stirring up some of these other questions. And so maybe some are saying, yes, it's just best to end your marriage altogether. In fact, since women are actually addressed first here in verse 10, like the wife must not leave her husband, like they're addressed first, and they're actually given more direct instructions because the whole parenthetical statement in the first half of verse 11 is addressed to the wife. Well, since that's the case, which was very countercultural, right? Normally you would address the husband first and primarily the husband at all. It may suggest, some scholars have speculated, that perhaps women were actually more the cause of this issue. We don't know that. And so either they're just importing the easy divorce of Corinthian culture, or they're taking that combined with this idea that, hey, abstaining from sex and marriage is more spiritual anyhow. And so either way, however it came about, Paul recognizes this as a discipleship problem, and so he makes his instructions crystal clear. The Lord's way is not to divorce each other. Now, what about that middle part where Paul says to remain unmarried or else be reconciled to your husband? If she does leave, if she divorces, she should remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. What about that part? Well, again, it would be helpful if we knew some of the specific circumstances as to why women were leaving their marriages. We don't have those details. And again, this language is somewhat the language of an exception here, right? The ideal is no divorce, but if it does happen, that's sort of the sense of the language here. Here's an exception to the ideal. So ideal, no divorce, but if it does happen, and the exception is, if it does happen, remain unmarried or be reconciled. Now, we must remember that Paul is summarizing and applying Jesus' teaching to this new context in Corinth. And Jesus' teaching is clear. No divorce and remarriage. In Jesus' teaching, Matthew 5, Matthew 19, no divorce and remarriage because that's a form of adultery. What he means by that, when Jesus says that, is that it's unfaithfulness to your marriage vows. To divorce and remarry is a form of unfaithfulness to your spouse. Now, here's something that's really important to note. In Jesus' culture, divorce and remarriage always went together. Not so much in Corinth, but in Israel and among the Jews, divorce and remarriage were two parts of one whole. What I mean by that is an authorized divorce necessarily entailed the freedom to remarry. In fact, it was usually included in the divorce papers. So-and-so divorced, thus she's free to remarry. That's the way it worked in Jesus' culture. Which is why Jesus actually offered one case where divorce and remarriage was permissible, and that was the case of adultery. So in that case, divorce was authorized, which meant remarriage was allowed. That's the way it worked in their culture. So if a divorce was legal and authorized under God's law, then remarriage was allowed. That's the way it worked for Jesus. Now in Corinth, it wasn't so much that way. Paul's actually going to go on in verses 12 through 16 and offer another case where he sees remarriage being allowed. A new case that comes up in this new context in Corinth. So we'll get to that in verses 12 through 16 here in a second. But in this case, where you have two believers that are, Paul says, well, if she does leave him. So two believers, a divorce has happened, and there's been presumably no adultery. That seems to be what Paul is getting at. Well, then she should remain unmarried or be reconciled. He's applying Jesus' teaching, and because he says she needs to remain unmarried and not remarry, then that would mean there's presumably no adultery here in this context. Again, we don't know why the divorce is happening. What Paul says at the end of verse 11 then to the men is basically, look, what I just said about wives, that's also true about you husbands. The command goes both ways. What's true for wives in this, true for husbands. The standards are the same. So, no divorce. If it does happen, then remain unmarried or else be reconciled to your spouse. Now, one other thing to note before we move on to the next section. The modern church, at least in my cultural context here in America and in Western kind of European nations, sort of has a divided approach to the question of divorce. On one hand, it's like in Corinth, fairly common. It's common in the broader culture, and sadly, it's also common in the church. But on the other hand, we've historically attached a lot of shame around divorce, so much so that people in the church are kind of ashamed to mention that they are divorced, and sometimes they've been ostracized when it does happen. And neither of those matches Paul's instructions here. Paul's command following Jesus' lead is clear. Divorce is not the Lord's way. But Paul also acknowledges that it may happen, and he does so, if you notice, with no hint of shame. A couple who divorced in Corinth, in the church at Corinth, wasn't pushed out of the community in any way. Paul's like, oh, that happens, and if that's the case, then just remain unmarried or else be reconciled to your spouse. Both parts of this, the divorce is not the Lord's way, no shame if it does happen. Both parts of that are important. Now, the next related issue for them, what about if you're married to an unbeliever? Like, what if you're married to a pagan in Corinth? Should you divorce then? So Paul says in verse 12, but to the rest I say. What does he mean by to the rest? Well, he means those married to unbelievers. That becomes very clear in what he's dealing with here. So you've got those married to believers up above. He just gave those instructions in verses 10 and 11, beginning in verse 12, but to the rest, i.e., those married to unbelievers. So he says, but to the rest I say, not the Lord. That is, there's no direct teaching from Jesus on this subject. In verses 10 and 11, Paul passes on and applies Jesus' teaching on divorce and remarriage. But Jesus never addressed the question of disciples who were married to pagans because it wouldn't have come up in his ministry. So, on that question, here's what Paul has to say. That if a brother has an unbelieving wife and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if any woman, meaning believing woman, has an unbelieving husband and he consents to live with her, she must not divorce her husband. So once again, it's clear. Disciples are not to initiate divorce even in mixed marriages. Oftentimes in the culture of a place like Corinth, the household would take on the religion of the head of the household. So if the man converted to whatever religion it was, in this case Christianity, then oftentimes the household would follow suit, but not always. In fact, we have examples of that. We have examples of wives choosing a new religion different than their husbands as well. So this is a reality that happened in the broader culture with other kinds of religions, and now it's happening here in the church. And so Paul addresses the head of the household first, the husband, and then his wife next. And he says, look, if you become a believer and your wife doesn't come to Christ with you, but she's still willing to be married to you, then stay married. Likewise, if the wife comes to Christ and her husband doesn't, but he's willing to stay married to you, well, then stay married. So, if the unbeliever consents, Paul's instructions is don't divorce, but remain married. This actually anticipates the exception that's going to come here in verse 15, this idea of the unbeliever consenting. Paul's going to give another exception down below. But the basic idea is if they consent to be married, then stay married. Then in verse 14, Paul gives a reason for it. And the reason actually suggests what lies at the heart of their concern with this marriage. If I'm in a mixed marriage to a pagan, does that cause some moral problem for me, some standing problem for me, right? So this is what he says. For, giving a reason, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise, your children are unclean, but now they're holy. So, for indicates, as I stated, that he's giving the reason for remaining married. And in a nutshell, the reason he gives is the impact you have on your unbelieving spouse and on your children. In a nutshell, that's the reason. Now, he states that reason as, that impact as, being sanctified, being made clean, being holy. And that becomes a little unclear because Paul's language here is unique. He doesn't typically use language this way. So what exactly does Paul mean by being sanctified or being clean or being holy? Well, we know what it clearly does not mean. It doesn't mean that they're saved. How do we know that? Well, besides the fact that's completely out of sync with everything the New Testament says about salvation, look at verse 16. Verse 16 says, stay married, because how do you know you might save your husband? How do you know you might save your wife? So it's perfectly clear, whatever he means by being sanctified and holy, he doesn't mean saved. So what does he mean here? Well, I think what he means actually lies at the heart of some of their concern for being in these mixed marriages and why they think maybe they should get a divorce. So let's think about this carefully. Recall that the Corinthians sent Paul a letter with details of their concerns. Now, we don't have all the contents of that letter, but what we do know is their concern is for what's best, what's good, what's the most holy way to live with regard to sexuality and marriage, right? We know that's at least part of their concern. So it seems probable to me that in a marriage where someone came to faith, but their spouse did not, the concern is, does being married, that is, being in this union with an unbeliever, a pagan, does that make me unholy? In our context, that doesn't totally resonate with us, but in their collectivist world, as well as in their religious world, this makes perfect sense. Because in a collectivist society, your status was more a we thing than a me thing. What I mean by that is, in a collectivist culture, your identity and your status were defined by the people you were a part of, by your family and your clan and all of that. Your status and your identity was shaped by that. Not only that, in their culture religiously, unholy and unclean had more to do with like a status or a state of being or a standing. That is, to be holy or clean was a state you were in more than having to do with morality. For example, a priest or a priestess in such and such temple was holy, not because they were particularly morally good. They were holy because of their position as a priest or a priestess. So, in that context, think about this. If you're part of a marriage and a household where pagan gods were worshipped, pagan meat was eaten, pagan practices were honored, incense was burnt to pagan gods. If you're part of this household and this family and this marriage, you're in union like this, does that put you in the category of unholy or unclean? That's very much the kind of thing that would have been a real concern for at least some people in the Corinthian church. And so if that's what they're struggling with, and it seems most likely to me that makes the most sense of the data we have, then that would explain the unique way Paul uses his language here. Because he's addressing their concern in the language and the way they're wrestling with it. So what Paul says then is, no, if you're married and in this union, does that make you unclean or unholy? No, it doesn't. Actually, holiness and cleanness goes the other way. Your status as sanctified, your status as holy and clean affects the unbeliever, not the other way around. We need to remember that the word sanctified is from the same root word as holy, and the basic meaning is set apart or separate. That's why, for example, even in the Old Testament, both in Greek and in the original Hebrew of the Old Testament, you could have objects in the tabernacle or temple being described as holy. They were in a position or a category of holiness, set apart for God. Not morally speaking, but they're in God's sphere and used for His purposes. So, for believers, being sanctified is a state they are in as well as a process that is happening to them. So, what I think Paul is saying here is that your presence in your marriage and in your household brings your spouse and your children into the sphere of holy things, into the sphere of the Lord Jesus and God and the gospel and all that goes with it. So rather than their unholiness and their uncleanness tainting you, your sanctification, your set-apartness, your holiness blesses them with being in the presence of God's work and God's good things. So don't divorce them. That's the force of what Paul is getting at. But what if the unbelieving spouse is unwilling to stay married? What if they're the ones that are like, no, I don't want to be married to you because you've just adopted this weird religion over here that worships some crucified Savior and Messiah? What if the unbelieving spouse wants to leave? Well, look at verse 15. Yet, if the unbelieving one is leaving, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. So, the ultimate goal is to stay married and for there to be harmony, peace. God has called us to peace. As far as that's possible, to live at peace with all people, Paul says in Romans, do so. But if they choose to leave, well then, the most peaceful thing you could do is let them leave, and you could do it in the most harmonious way possible. And also notice the two statements he says. Let them leave and no longer bound. So if the unbelieving one wants to leave, then you as the believer, let them leave. And if that happens, then you as the disciple, the believer, you're not under bondage. What does those two statements mean? Well, let them leave means let them get a divorce. They're free to leave the marriage. No longer bound in the language of the day means you're free to remarry. And Paul seems to be adding a case to what Jesus said. Jesus said that in the case of adultery, divorce and remarriage can happen. Paul seems to add here that if an unbeliever leaves, then you're free to remarry. That's the force of not under bondage in such cases, meaning you're not bound to this marriage any longer. You are free, and that means free to remarry. Then in verse 16, Paul gives a second reason for really staying married if the unbeliever wants to stay married. And that is, you don't know, again, the impact you might have on them. You might lead them to salvation. He says in verse 16, for how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? And how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Again, that indicates that Paul is not talking about salvation when he mentions sanctification and holiness up above in verse 14, but it still speaks to the impact. And so the believing person's presence in their marriage and in their household has an impact. It brings them into the realm of God's work and God's holy things, and there's just this possibility that that might lead to their salvation. And so stay married because you might just save your husband. Stay married if they're willing to stay married because you might just save your wife. All right, to wrap this up, let me just offer a few kind of reflections or thoughts. And the main one is this, that it's very clear here in what Paul says is that marriage is designed by God to be permanent. That's the ideal. Of course, in a fallen world, that ideal is not always realized. We know that. But that's the goal. And that's what we should commit to. And that's what, as disciples of Jesus, we should strive to become the kind of people who are capable of carrying out the virtues that God intends to form in us in Christ by the Spirit. They will actually help make a permanent marriage possible, right? Like humility and gentleness and patience and kindness and considering others more important than myself. These kind of virtues and character traits that God by the Spirit is seeking to form in us, those are the kinds of things that will actually help us realize God's ideal of a permanent marriage. Now, again, we know that doesn't always work in a fallen world. And so the other part of this is that there needs to be grace in God's community, among God's family. There needs to be grace for the divorced, like no hint of shame. I was preaching through the Sermon on the Mount a handful of years ago at a church where I was preaching regularly. And Matthew chapter 5, Sermon on the Mount, you have the divorce passage mentioned in there. I wanted to gather some of the people in the congregation who had been divorced to help me write that sermon so that I could get their input on the message as I worked through it. I actually grew up in a home where my mom and dad were divorced. I understood some of the dynamics from a kid's point of view. I wanted their input from a marriage point of view. And so I was going to gather this little focus group of people to help me think through this passage and this message. So one Sunday, I pulled a gal aside in the lobby who I knew had been divorced. I asked her, I said, called her by name and said, I know that you've been divorced. Before I could get the next sentence out of my mouth, she hung her head in shame, covered her face, and she said to me, I know, am I going to go to hell? This was a gal who had been walking with Jesus now for a long time at this point, 15, 20 years. She was actually married to her second husband at this point, and they had been married for well over a decade and had a healthy marriage. And she still carried the shame of her divorce. And that's sad. And it should not be that way. They should not feel ostracized or banished or less than in the community of God's people. And so somehow we've got to hold both those two things together in tension. Marriage is designed to be permanent by God, and yet there needs to be grace when it doesn't work out. All right, thanks for tuning in to this session on the Listener's Commentary on 1 Corinthians. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by people just like you, people who give $5 a month, $20 a month, $50 a month, whatever they can afford to help make this ministry possible so that it can continue to grow and have an impact on people all around the world. So if you're one of the supporters of this ministry, thanks a ton for your support. If you're somebody who's been blessed and impacted by this ministry, would you consider setting up a monthly donation or giving a one-time gift? You can do that at listenerscommentary.com, listenerscommentary.com. Click the Give button, and you can set up a recurring monthly donation right there by putting in the amount, checking the box that says Make This Monthly, or you can give a one-time donation there as well. Thanks a ton for your support.